Michelle from Michelle Loves Books. Welcome back to my channel. Today is time for 7 on Sundays prompt. As usual, I will leave the link to the Goodreads group that this is from in the description box below. This week's prompt is tropes that I love. I prepared for this week so much better than I prepared for last week. I really kind of wish I did last week's prompt a little bit differently. But anyways, let's get into it. 7 tropes that I love. We are going to start with love triangles. I know this one is at the top of everyone's hate list, but I love love triangles. I am not tired of them. I do think it is important to note that with any trope, they can be poorly done versus well done, and that sometimes might be a personal taste. It just really has to make sense. The angst has to be there. It cannot be an easy or obvious decision. 2 of my favorite love triangles off the top of my head are Twilight. Okay, but like for real, were you surprised? I feel like it was very well done despite who the reader would have chosen for Bella. I think that Bella was given a very difficult decision. On one hand, she loves Edward, but there was an element of trust that was broken there for her with Edward. But he will always hold her heart the first love of her life, and that is a very powerful thing. But also she would have to become a vampire to stay with him. On the other hand, she has Jake the werewolf, who she wouldn't have to change for, but it is a little bit dangerous staying with him as well as they stress with what happened with Sam's wife. But she wouldn't have to hide from society. She could keep all of her friends and family and ultimately have a normal life. Plus, she does also love Jake. I think definitely in a different way than she loves Edward. And we could debate all of this, but those were her decisions. I think that her decision just has a lot of layers, a lot of consequences, a lot of people weighing in on their opinion of what she should do, and her self-discovery of deciding, despite what everyone else thinks, what she needs in her life. The other love triangle, and I have the book, but it's way up there. I didn't want to get a step stool to get the book. But the other love triangle that I thought was very well done was in the Infernal Devices, between Tessa, Will, and Jem. Jem and Will are kind of similar, but also completely opposite. It's really weird. They also have this parabatai thing, which kind of, in my opinion, makes for this polyamorous relationship in a weird way for Tessa, because in certain ways, she will always be the third wheel. I think parabatai will always choose each other, no matter what. So even if she is the wife, the parabatai is kind of equal in importance. So spoiler alert, by the way, I will, when I'm done talking about this book, I will put it down if you're really worried about that. On one hand, we have Jem, who has this ailment that's going to kill him, but he's sweet, he's easy to love, he's good. But Will is the wild card, the bad boy. He's kind of an asshole. There are some moments in here I'm like, what is wrong with you, Tessa? How can you love him? She still inevitably falls in love with him. She sees the good in him, despite how he treats her. He's also got this tortured soul thing going on because he believes that he's afflicted by this curse. Even when she kind of gave up on him, she still knew that there was good in him, but then she realizes that what his motivations for being an asshole were. So she just can't help herself. She loves him. And I kind of love that she gets to have both of them eventually. Moving on to number 2. Now the second trope that I love, we're gonna sort of group these together because they're just 2 sides of the same coin, are the rags to riches and riches to rags trope. I love that trope so much because you can see how the change affects the character so dramatically. It really gives the opportunity to see for how the other side lives and experience sometimes what might be considered insignificant things in a completely different way. For one rags to riches example, and I was going to say America Singer from the Selection series, but I'm gonna, Arya, no, go. But I'm gonna go with Katniss Everdeen from The Hunger Games instead. As we all know, but we're gonna go over it anyways, she comes from a completely impoverished district where starving to death is a real threat. Even among her district, she is probably in a better position because she has the hunting skills. So when she gets whisked away to the capital, there are just so many instances where you see that huge divide from poor to rich. I really like that in Katniss's case, she's so angry that she's very critical of everything. So you really get to see all the different ways that they are just awful people and they have more than she has and how they just waste it. So it gives a different perspective as she is forced into it. We see this crazy abundance of so much food, particularly at a party, which I think isn't until, is it in this book? It doesn't really matter. We all know this scene, particularly at a party where the citizens of the capital just eat and eat and eat until they can't eat anymore, and then they make themselves sick so that they can eat more. It's just really disgusting. Also with the costuming and the primping and how much those material things just matter to the core belief of the capital citizens, when people in her district and other districts have other worries about just survival and not offending the peacekeepers so they don't get beaten to death. And like that's their reality versus the show business of the capital. Now for my other example, I don't actually have the book. I listened to it, oh gosh, over a year ago on audiobook for the riches to rags scenario. And honestly, I don't actually have another example of this. I was like trying to think if there's any other stories where I read this, and I can't think of any. If you have any recommendations, please feel free to leave them for me. Anyways, I particularly liked the Glittering Court series. Well, the first book. The series follows 3 girls who are taken from poverty into like a training program, which is like a finishing school really, and they are made to look pretty and sold off to wealthy men. Okay, now it's really not as bad as it seems, which it sounds really bad. I know how bad that sounds, but they don't have to go down that path. This is purely a choice. It's also historical back when there are arranged marriages. So long story short, that doesn't have to be their fate. But that's basically the idea, to give these women a better chance to kind of move up in the world. Now getting into the spoilers of this book to kind of explain myself, Adelaide, our main character of the Glittering Court. Now each book in the series, there's 3 the primary friends, and each book follows a perspective of one of those friends, and it's the same story just from their perspective. The first book, The Glittering Court, follows Adelaide. She is from a rich, wealthy family, and her maid was supposed to be chosen. But Adelaide was getting forced into an arranged marriage that she was not happy with, so she switches places with her maid. And so she goes off to finishing school. It wasn't a fully fleshed out plan. It was kind of a knee-jerk panic reaction, and she just did it on a whim. I don't think she realized how far she would have to follow it through. I really liked that poverty was not only marked by the clothes she was wearing, but also the way she spoke, sits, moves, eats, carries herself in general. So she really had to tweak her behavior and her body language and the way she acted to fit in better and not call attention to herself. She's not really like a maid or whatever like these other women are. I also really liked that it didn't come easy to her. The other person that was privy to what was going on in her situation and trying to help her hide her identity was giving her pointers on like, hey, like you're slipping, and it wasn't an easy thing for her to change what she had been raised to do. But in times of like God, Arya, you're being really annoying right now. But in times when she's like emotional or something, sometimes she would slip. So I just thought it was so well written and so thought out. The third trope that I really like is hidden identities, for whatever reason that may be. My favorite example, again, is Twilight, but I can't think of another one where this hidden identity is on such a large scale. How the vampires of this world have kept their secret for so long. Also, in all the ways that it has been challenged or could potentially be challenged as an outsider, what that meant for Bella, and even her tiny mark on the world as a human, and the few relationships that she has, what that would mean if she decided to carry on an eternal life with Edward and have to cut ties to those relationships as a human. I really just cannot see how people hate this series so much. Some concepts like this are just glossed over in other YA books, but you just cannot deny how well fleshed out the whole idea is. Just saying. All right, Erin, what's up? I don't know, probably like a good hour. It's a good enough time for get some exercise. The fourth trope that I really love is when a character, I don't know what to call this one, so I'm just gonna explain it. When a character like puts on this whole act of being a grade A douche, but really they're not. They're really good at heart, and they're just really misunderstood. My all-time favorite asshole is Rysand. He plays this fearsome, villainous character who's dark and vicious that even some of the most powerful fae are fearsome of. But I just love his motivations. They run really deep. They are so well written and flushed out, and they make sense. The deep layers to his character and why he played his part the way he played it out. And also, the stakes are really high. If he didn't play it out that way, it could mean the end of his kindness and his selflessness, and what he's protecting becomes a secret almost. And granted, there's a lot of people who are privy to the secret, but it's still really small in the grand scale of things that you as the reader almost feel privileged to be a part of. It's so well played. His character is also a really good example of the next trope on my list, the 5th trope, which is going to be morally gray and the anti-hero types. I think that this type of character is the most interesting character and has so much more potential. Mostly is by far so much more realistic than your good versus evil characters. I feel like our anti-hero types don't just blindly choose to just be evil for the sake of being evil. The anti-hero types and morally gray types just realistically weigh all of their options and all of the stakes and consequences of their actions. That makes sense to me. I can understand that. They also tend to have much more complex motivations. And usually that means that if it's done well, their character in general has to be really flushed out so that we can understand why they make the decisions that they make. And I really like that we can kind of have all the options and consequences laid out on the table. As a reader, I like to be like, well, what would I do if I was in that position? What would I have chosen? When the characters are just purely evil or purely heroic, I just really have a hard time identifying with them. One example of just a purely evil character, the Darkling. I feel like he just wasn't a very strong villain for me. I think he's stronger than some because he does have a little bit deeper motivation than just power. I really don't like the power struggle. I feel like part of his evilness is the desire to not be alone. And that's why he kind of latched onto the one other person that he felt like could understand him. So the motivation's a little bit better here. Throughout the series, it kind of lost it for me too. He was all over the fucking place. Didn't make sense to me. We're not talking about what I don't like, we're talking about what I do like. So moving on to the 6th trope that I really love. I love the character who's a book lover. It's like an immediate connection to the character. I think that we all like to have something that we can identify with a character that we love, especially if they are our primary character. But my favorite book nerd character is Katie from the Lux series because she films book reviews, she writes for a blog, and she receives book mail and arcs that she's given for reviews. There's a situation, I think it's like the 2nd or 3rd book, where spoiler alert by the way, again, there's a scenario where she's taken away from her life for some time and she's not able to, do the things that she does, read and review and do all those things. And that's the first thing that comes to her mind is her book mail must be piling up. She needs to check in with the publishers who have sent her books, and that's the first thing that would be on my mind too. I love Katie as a character. And lastly, the seventh trope, I'm kind of grouping it together, and that is 2 of my favorite settings. And I guess they're kind of tropey I guess settings can be tropes, right? And that is boarding schools and small towns. And I just feel like the craziest stuff always happens in those places. There's a certain atmosphere that's just inherent to those locations for some reason. It's really impossible, I think, to choose a favorite boarding school setting. There's also different types of boarding school settings, like the magical boarding schools and the academic boarding schools. And sometimes they kind of overlap. So we're gonna go with 2 of my favorite boarding schools, which I think the first one's pretty obvious as Hogwarts. It's just so well written and so picturesque. I just feel like it really stands out because While a lot of stories might be set in a school setting, you don't really always get the very best picture set up that you can imagine the school, what it would look like, and what it's like to really go to school there. And that is definitely very prevalent in the Harry Potter books. The other one is the Vampire Academy series. Now granted, you don't always get you have a few locations within the school that you can kind of picture. So we have a little bit different academic setting, because in this vampire series, which I love the vampire system in this series, our vampires obviously go to night school, and these vampires will not just burst into flames, but they can't tolerate a lot of sunlight. And then we have the Dompiers. In addition to night school, they do physical guardian training during the day when the vampires are sleeping. And I forgot, they don't like to be called vampires. So, as for small town settings, the first one that comes to mind is a book that I think has just been on my mind because I really want to do a reread of it. I read it actually when I first started my YouTube channel for the first readathon that I ever joined in the booktube community. So I guess it's just really on my mind, but that is The Wicked Deep by Shea Earnshaw. This was such a surprising, atmospheric, spooky, twisty book with witches. And this small town has like this really long history as well. The whole like supernatural elements are based on like some old legend. This book was so masterfully created to weave all of that into such a short book. But anyways, small town, twisty, supernatural, witchy, very atmospheric small town. I do remember that while people enjoyed this book, I don't think that they loved it as much as I loved it. But anyways, that wraps up 7 tropes that I love. I cannot wait to see everyone else's videos. If you have participated in the 7 on Sundays prompt, drop your links below. I would love to see your videos. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.